This session, welcome to the session on debates, practices, and praxis in using CRE in complex contexts. My name is Kirkhart, and I have the privilege of being assigned to chair this session. And I'm really excited about it because there are three very exciting papers in three different settings: a museum of science in Boston, United States, a YMCA early learning program in Metro Chicago, United States, and a fourth grade classroom in the Midwestern United States. Collectively, these address issues of identity, engagement, belonging, and exclusion using context-relevant theories. So it's a wonderful mix of theory and application. So the term praxis is well chosen here. In keeping with the conference theme, these authors will challenge us to consider ways in which our work may disrupt or perpetuate racism and colonialism. Our format today is that all three authors, as requested, have submitted videos, which G will be playing for us, and then it will open to discussion live after that so that we can appreciate the juxtaposition of these ideas. Our first paper is titled Affect and Decolonialization, Uncovering Emotional Manifestations of Marginalization and Belonging in a Museum. Authors are Katie Todd and Sarah May, and Katie will be presenting today. So G, if you want to start the first video.
Okay. I suggest that maybe we let Jen and Elizabeth to go first while I download it from the YouTube and test the audio first.
Oh, absolutely.
Possible?
Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem. Yep. I feel like
Okay.
I'm screaming at everyone now. All right, let me introduce the second speaker. This paper is Utilization of an Anti-Bias Literacy Approach in Early Learning, Lessons Learned from the First 3 Years of the YQ Early Learning Initiative. Authors are Jen Cooper, Elizabeth Frank, Ashley Nazarek, Melanie Stathis, Jasmine Rogazner, Tanya Rempert, Marla Stamps, and Jay Ward. And presenting today are Jen and Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's see if this works. So I am going to share my screen.
Perfect.
What are you all seeing? I think I actually might have shared the wrong screen.
I see your first slide. It's a title slide.
Okay, great. Perfect.
With you and Beth listed. Yep, that one.
Is it in a frozen sort of format?
Right now it is.
Okay, let me stop sharing really fast. Don't you love technology? Good thing there's two of us, so I can always bypass it to Beth if I need to. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to share again. Just checking sound settings really quick. Okay, I'm gonna get us going and let me know how the sound is on everyone's end. Hi everyone, I'm Jen Cooper and I am the Director of Measurement and Evaluation at the YMCA of Metro Chicago. And today I'm joined by WISE evaluation partner Beth Frank from Planning Evaluation Implementation Org, or PI.org. And we are here to share some work around the anti-bias content within the WISE early learning programming. So to orient you to the YMCA is an association that spans 3 states. And at any given time, we are running between 100 to 200 programs. A subset of our programming is under Head Start. And for those that aren't familiar, Head Start is a federally funded program that was started in the 60s. And it was really started to disrupt the cycle of poverty for low-income families, specifically in their attainment and access to high-quality education for children 0 to 5. So it is an early learning programming. Currently, the Y is operating 9 early learning sites throughout the west and south sides of the city. We have a good footprint in the west side, and we've been running programming for 40 years. So we have a pretty good standing within the Chicagoland area. In 2016, the Y began to ask questions about really how do we optimize quality within our Head Start space? And not only how do we optimize quality, but how do we also advance equity? That's a really important component of this work. And this is how the YQ Early Learning Initiative was born. The YQ Early Learning Initiative is kind of outlined in the graphic that you'll see on the bottom right of your screen. And it really says, and we believe, that if you combine science and research and also enhance the learning climate for staff, then we can ultimately move the needle on school outcomes, student outcomes, specifically school readiness for our 0 to 5-year-olds. And really the foundation of our YQ Early Learning Initiative is this staff piece, the middle part of this theory of change, where we're optimizing the learning climate. So a little bit more about that. We really place emphasis on a robust professional development system for our staff. This includes our early learning teachers as well as site directors. They're brought through an immersive professional learning community model, also known as PLCs, where they focus on curriculum and content that is motivated by the Y social justice framework. And that framework has 3 main pieces: trauma-informed care, culturally responsive pedagogy, and anti-bias education. This framework really focuses on developing critical skills and moving away from just thinking about basic skills. And our PLCs are also complemented by reflective supervision and coaching. So it's really a holistic PD system. We believe that this not only increases quality, but also can advance equity. So a little bit about how the evaluation piece is mirroring the programming piece, both on our program side and in the WISE evaluation processes. Everything we do is to promote equity. And so really to advance equity in both spaces, how are we keeping a pulse on the social, cultural, political, and historical context that people are not only bringing to their work in the case of our teachers, but are also bringing to the classroom in the case of our families and students. And so after doing this work for a few years, the Y began to formulate some questions. We had some questions that we wanted answered, and that's what you'll see in that blue box there. In short, we really wanted to know that if things that were being taught to our teachers, really the social justice framework and specifically components of our anti-bias education, were transferring into classroom practice. And if it was, what exactly did that look like? How much of something being taught in our PLC setting did a teacher need to have or to uptake in order for those concepts to appear in the classroom? And so this is when we brought on Pi.org, our external evaluation partner, and I'll hand it over to Beth, who can share more about how we dove deeper into these questions.
So at Pi, we took a utilization approach to this evaluation, focusing on data the YMCA needed to strengthen their work. They had a number of data sources already, but they lacked data that specifically linked the PLCs with teaching practices related to the anti-bias literacy curriculum. That, however, is the crux of this work. YMCA was intentionally engaged with staff and leadership, co-creating the PLCs themselves. They had also been building in reflective practices that incorporated data and evaluation. So we wanted to draw from those foundations this evaluation and build tools from their learnings and their intense engagement in this area. So this led us to developing a fidelity tool. So how did we do this? So on the next slide, we see some of these key steps. This was an iterative and collaborative process. It wasn't always linear, and this work takes time. We consulted with YMCA throughout this process with targeted conversations. And so you see that across the top there. We started with a comprehensive document review of YMCA background documents, the frameworks they pulled from, and previously developed tools. Through this process, we identified priority components that YMCA, that together we decided to include in this tool, namely storytizing, inquiry style, or how teachers interact with students verbally through inquiry, and anti-bias content and topics. A joint YMCA and PI team reviewed lesson observation videos to better understand those key practices as we were building out the tool. We then piloted the tool through simultaneous viewing, again, the joint YMCA PI team, through simultaneous viewing, discussion, and coding. And we adjusted the tool based on feedback from that process. So that we then came to the data set. A sample, which you see on the next slide. We identified a sample of 19 teachers with 90 observation videos, and we selected this sample based on several criteria. So an urban location, so based in the city of Chicago itself, teaching at the preschool level. We included teachers with both high and low PLC attendance levels, and also looked at additional data, so teachers with class scores. We then assessed the lessons via consensus scoring. So on the next slide, we see a sample of the tool and rubric. There were 8 sections of the tool, including lesson introduction, vocabulary development, as well as some of those key topics that I mentioned, storytizing, inquiry style, anti-bias practices and topics. We developed a 4-point scale: absent, emergent, present, and outstanding, as well as a no opportunity category. We developed descriptions for each of those criteria, for each of those instructional components, as you see a sample here. And then we adapted this tool for different types of activities. So for read aloud activities, storybook illustrations, and then an other activities category. On the next slide, we see what we found from this data and from the analysis. So we pulled from the Fidelity tool lesson observations. We also pulled from PLC attendance and topics data and from class. So class is an observational tool that assesses quality of teaching in the classroom based on teacher-child interactions, and it's commonly used across different early learning classrooms. So 3 findings we wanted to share with you today. PLC impacts teacher practices. We found increased application of practices in the classroom over time. We also analyzed the PLC topic areas. On average, we found that teachers had limited exposure to priority topic areas. That was a surprise, but we found that practices improved regardless of those low dosage rates. And we also looked at practices observed in the PLC Fidelity tool with class instructional quality scores, but we did not see a strong association there. On the next slide, we see some numbers that further illustrate these findings. So there was a marked increase in observed practices from the beginning of the PLC initiative in 2016 through 2019. So jumping from 13% to 52% of everything that we observed. The data set included, and we also found that 80% of teachers showed improvement from their first observation to their last available observation. So again, we see this improvement over time. We also looked at different types of activities and instructional components. We found that certain instructional components were more evident in one type of activity versus the other. So for example, higher order inquiry style was more commonly observed in read alouds, whereas anti-bias practices and topics were more common in storybook illustration activities. On the next slide, we see limitations experienced within this evaluation. The first is that despite a large data set, there were missing data. A second and third limitation are related. So the pandemic impacted the context. It also impacted the evaluation in that we were planning to do in-person observations, but we were planning to do those in the first few months of the pandemic. And so instead, for lack of access to those classrooms, we instead used the existing video recorded lessons from previous lessons. Similarly, we had intended to do focus groups and surveys with teachers and staff, but because of the context at that point, point. In discussion with YMCA, for various reasons, we opted not to do that. So we pivoted the evaluation to continue to consider what are those data needs, those critical data needs of YMCA, to better understand, reflect on, and further plan for this work. And I'll hand it over to Jen.
Thanks, Beth. So after we had these amazing results and a fidelity tool, we were left with some really good lessons learned that I want to just spotlight really quick. First, while this work did center around a culturally responsive pedagogy, the evaluative component of this was more or less traditional in nature. So moving forward, how do we really ensure that a process like this has more components of culturally responsive evaluation? Second, this analysis did show some really positive evidence that the content provided to teachers within our PD system did move into classroom practice and that there is a knowledge transfer there. Over the course of 4 years of videos, we saw more concepts from PLCs appear, and we saw them appear more often, which was really an amazing finding to us. This work did focus on the content within PLCs, but we really want to continue to note that this is part of a broader PD system. And so how do we really tease out the effects from the PLC content or PLC space versus the broader PD system that has more of a wraparound structure? Lastly, we continue to acknowledge that equity needs to be at the forefront, and robust, culturally responsive PD systems are not necessarily the norm within the early learning spaces, and so it's critical that this is maintained. Some future state for this work, we're going to be diving into child outcomes. So again, the knowledge transfer from PLC to teachers to students, what does that look like? That was not a part of this analysis, so that'll be done within the future. How do we continue to innovate our anti-bias work? That's something that we think about a lot within the Y, and so how do we continue to move that forward? How do we specifically accommodate limitations, but also look at gains as we move into the future for those areas that were ranked more low in accordance with the fidelity tool? So those are some areas for future considerations and future analyses. With that, we thank you so much for attending this presentation, and we're open to taking questions.
Thank you very much for that video recorded presentation. And take a moment, audience participants, to jot your notes to capture any questions that you want to come back to for this particular presentation as we move on to the second one. She has let me know that Katie's video still experiences audio challenges, and so Katie's chosen to present her paper live today. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Katie for a live presentation of the paper on affect and decolonization, uncovering emotional manifestations of marginalization and belonging in a museum. Katie.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that with the live version, you won't get to see the version where I had to record multiple times to get it to just the way I wanted it, but bear with me. Hopefully, at least this way you can hear me. So just get things going. But yeah, just as an introduction, my name is Katie Todd. For pronouns, I use my initials KT or she and her. My parents are Barbara and Paul Schaefer. I'm a descendant both of the colonized and the colonizers. I experienced privilege based on my whiteness, my educational background, my current economic stability, my family and community support, and my religious identity. And as a person of faith, I see it as my calling to dedicate my work to using my privilege to name it, challenge it, and disrupt it. I believe people like me design structural oppression, and it's our responsibility to dismantle it. I also live in the tension that my ability to choose to follow that calling is itself a privilege, and in doing so, I'm centering my whiteness in problematic ways and constantly benefiting from the privilege that I aim to unsettle. Along with my privileges, I also live daily experiences of having the world not designed for my gender identity, and I know firsthand what a disabling environment feels like to me. I also believe in informal learning. When we think of learning, we typically think of schools, but in the US, school-age children spend an average of 1,195 hours in school each year. Now, there are 8,760 hours in a year, and if we sleep 8 hours a day, we have 5,848 waking hours each year. So 1,195 hours out of 5,840 waking hours is just 20% of waking hours that school-age children spend in school. So as much learning as may happen in school, there's a lot more potential for learning outside of school. And let's consider this. I'm currently recording this video from land that was stolen from the Monongahela, the Seneca, the Hopewell, and the Shawnee people. And let's say I was a descendant of one of those groups and I care about learning and preserving my culture. That out of school time is most likely when I would do that. And for many students, and especially those who feel marginalized because of their genders, the people whom they love, the color of their skin, the abilities of their bodies, and all the other rich intersectional identities that defy demographic definition, informal learning is how you learn to be you. So there are many types of informal learning, some structured and some not structured at all, but today we'll talk about museums. The traditional concept of a museum is the product of Western colonization. It's focused on displaying objects that were often appropriated through violent or oppressive means. And even though science museums and children's museums, like where I have worked, tend to be known for hands-on interactives, they also have collections of artifacts ranging from taxidermy specimens, real human organs, Native American works of art, many of which have been acquired during colonialist periods. So museum history oozes whiteness and has institutionalized colonialist pedagogical, interpretive, and research practices. So let's look at an example. The current slide shows a picture of an exhibit at the Museum of Science, Boston, where the project I'm representing today is based. The photo shows a hunting trophy room, and on the wall, there are taxidermy heads of several breeds of antelope. Beneath them, the wall is lined with an array of spears. Black and white skin of an animal appears to be draped over a chair, and the walls and a small table are adorned with black and white photographs and a color painting that seems to depict a person with a gold halo riding a rearing horse. I want you to pause for a minute to take in the scene and notice how you feel in your body. Do you have a positive or a negative feeling? How much energy do you feel? Does this exhibit draw you in or does it push you away? Does it seem familiar or does it feel unknown? Does it conform with or does it challenge your values and your social norms? Colonel Colby dedicated this exhibit or donated this exhibit and a large sum of money to the Museum of Science with the terms that the museum could establish a large endowment to support ongoing work as long as the room is displayed to the public. And there are many artifacts in the room, and we know almost nothing about how Colonel Colby came to possess them, whether as gifts, through fair sale, or by violent means. We do know that many of these items originated with Native African people whose land was stolen by white colonists. And many museum staff and visitors have raised concerns about this room. And there have been efforts to learn about its history, to use the space to spark critical conversation and learning. But it remains an exhibit that sparks strong emotions for staff and visitors alike. So for the last several years, my colleagues and I have been learning with a wide range of museum visitors about the emotions that arise during a museum visit and the implications of those emotions. We ask questions like, what does it feel like to belong or to be excluded? How do our bodies actually respond at a physiological level? And what are the cultural meanings that we assign to those feelings? And most importantly, how can we design exhibits that foster a sense of belonging, especially for people of color, people with disabilities, and women and gender expansive people? So Audre Lorde wrote that our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. And we believe that focusing on emotions can serve as a decolonialist approach to our research and can help us build knowledge that helps us decolonize museum design. But the white male perspective that has dominated many norms of evaluation as a discipline has aligned with a scientific paradigm that for many years thought emotions were primal relics from which we would eventually evolve, that we should push down our feelings at all costs in order to elevate our rational brains, as if rationality and emotion were opposite. But the Neuroscientific Revolution has now provided scientists with persuasive evidence that supports what Audre Lorde and so many other women and people of color have known for generations, that our emotions are an essential part of what it means to be human. So if our evaluation approaches tell us to put aside those emotions for the sake of so-called objective answers, those approaches are depriving our participants from being their full selves. And our data are stripped of the richness of full humanity. Our society has expectations about who can express what emotions. As Dina Simmons wrote, concerned citizen calls on Black people napping, celebrating in the park, or entering their own homes make clear that certain groups of people are expected to regulate their behavior and emotions more strictly in public. But if these expectations exist, it means that emotion can be a form of resistance. And indeed, research has shown how people of color skillfully leverage nonverbal and affective assets to resist marginalization. And our evaluations can elevate these strengths. Abolishing the norms of emotional repression can serve to decolonize evaluation. And when we embrace emotions, when we recognize the importance of a knotted stomach or a racing pulse or tension in our temples, we can begin to uncover the contexts that make participants feel welcome or unwelcome, even when we can't put words to exactly what's wrong. So the project I'll focus on today is a National Science Foundation funded pilot and feasibility study that brings together the lenses of intersectionality and appraisal theory, a theory from affective science that contends that we're constantly evaluating or appraising our environments and making judgments that we process at an affective level, even before we can understand them as full-blown emotions like angry or happy or sad. We hypothesize that both the design of an exhibit and the ways museum visitors conceive of their intersectional identities within that space contribute to the ways they appraise exhibits, which in turn influences the way they choose to engage with the exhibit and their overall sense that the exhibit is designed for someone like them. As a pilot and feasibility study, our primary job in this project is to design a research protocol that can help us explore these ideas. We're doing this through 4 mini studies where we try out and refine our questions and our approaches. And our project focuses on youth aged 10 to 17. And we're working with incredible youth advisors with whom we have co-created our initial protocols and who help us interpret and refine our approach. We have also had the true honor of working with 2 teen researchers this summer who were involved in all stages of the first mini study that I'll share about momentarily. And additionally, we work with an amazing team of advisors, adult advisors who guide us in our research design, our youth development approaches, and insights about exhibit design. So 17 youth aged 10 to 16 participated in our first mini study. We recruited participants from the Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston and a list of people who have signed up to take part in research studies at the Museum of Science Boston. Participants received $50 for participating. And 6 of the youth identified as having a disability, 6 identified as female, 1 as demi-boy, 1 non-binary, and 8 as male. 3 identified as Black or African American, 2 as Asian or Asian American, 4 as Hispanic or Latinx, 2 another race, and 10 white. Our methods for this study began with a meaning map activity through which youth articulated the many intersecting factors of their identities. Based on youth and advisor input, the design inspiration for this activity was Instagram. So youth participants in our study wrote in words that described themselves and selected from a library of images or drew their own depictions of things that make them who they are. And then they described their selections. Although the library included images that evoked concepts of race, gender, and ability, only about a quarter of our 17 participants described these demographic factors during the activity. The most salient themes in youth's descriptions of themselves related to music, animals, and exercise. So following the meaning map, participants previewed 3 exhibits and filled out a brief questionnaire about their initial appraisals or emotions of the exhibits. Then they used one of the exhibits, filled out a second appraisal questionnaire about their overall experience, and then participated in an interview where researchers and participants discussed what aspects of the exhibit contributed to different appraisals and how the exhibits could be changed to support more valuable experiences. We also asked for suggestions about how to improve our research process and our questions. And because the main aim of our project is to develop instruments rather than to generate conclusive findings, many of our analyses focused on assessing different forms of validity, but I wanted to share 2 examples from our data that start to show how asking about affect and appraisals can open conversations that may be unlikely to arise from the traditional toolbox of museum researchers. So one of our participants introduced himself as being creative, active, fun. He spoke about helping people and not liking to see people hurt, as well as peace and quiet as things that made him who he was. Aside from noting that he identifies as male and that he was 13 years old, the participant did not wish to share about his racial and ethnic identities or other demographics. When this participant first viewed one of the museum exhibits, he was drawn to it. "Ooh, this game looks cool. I think we should try it," he said. And he indicated on his survey that he thought it seemed straightforward, that he would be good at it, and that it seemed designed for someone like him. But once he tried the exhibit, his feelings turned. He shared, "My energy when I was seeing it, I felt excited that it was a fun game, but when I tried it, my energy flipped around. It was the opposite of good energy when I tried it. It just fell apart." He added, "Looking at the game as being a kid, it makes it seem like it's fun, gaming, really understandable and really easy. But when I played it, I did not know what to do." Focusing on emotion, the participant confided, "I'm kind of embarrassed." Although the design features had drawn him in, the experience of actually using the activity turned things around for him. And this example is highly enlightening for our team. So often museum designers focus on the look of something, of wanting to get someone to try it out. And in this case, they succeeded. But what is the impact of this young man walking away feeling embarrassed and betrayed that the exhibit was not what he expected? How can we consider the full emotional experience of a visit so people leave feeling encouraged, successful, and supported? As a counterpoint, our protocol also generated many signs of success. So for instance, an 11-year-old participant who identified as an Asian American boy with disabilities had a consistently positive experience at the exhibit he tried. He shared, "It got my energy up because I was getting really excited." And while he rated his pleasantness as an 8 out of 10, both before and after the exhibit, he added, "I felt more pleasant afterwards." Even though he said, "At first I thought it looked difficult," he shared that after a few tries, I got the hang of it and started getting better at it. He talked about how doing the activity made him think of himself as a creative person, and he strongly agreed that it was designed for someone like him. He thought it was very fun and definitely worth my time. And he summarized, "I'm really into games. And if it's a game and you learn from it, I'm all up for it." So we have found that if we start asking people how they feel, we open up new ways of thinking about our spaces and empathizing with our participants. Our project will continue to gather data and refine our protocols over the next year, and we hope to have more insights to share. But I also hope to learn from you through the Q&A today or however you would like to connect. I also want to thank my current organization, the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh, and my former employer, the Museum of Science Boston, and the National Science Foundation for making space and providing funding for this work. And thank you to all of my co-conspirators for the project who could not be with me today. So that's what I've got for you right now. And like I said, can't wait to hear questions after the next paper.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was just amazing. And my head's already about to explode if I think about transposing some of the questions that arose in your setting onto the setting of the authors of the first paper. But we'll hold back on that until we hear a third addition to the mix, which is super creative, transnational debates on race on TikTok, presented by Yunjin Esther Nam.
My name is Yunjin. I am a PhD candidate at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Today I will be presenting on transnational debates of race on TikTok and students' own experiences. The purpose of this study was to examine the presence of transnational pop culture in non-academic and academic spaces among peers and how it mediates and influences and then is influenced by them in these spaces. I want to introduce the two student participants in this study. Nia and Elaine, both names are pseudonyms, were like two peas in a pod. They were always together when I went into their classrooms to observe. Nia and Elaine were born and raised in the States, and both identified themselves as Asian Americans. Nia specifically Vietnamese, Elaine specifically Cambodian Filipino. They were my teachers who taught me so much about what was trending amongst the students. And it was through them that I learned about TikTok. This research was done in 2019 before the pandemic and before TikTok gained more users during the pandemic. In 2020, it was estimated to have about 700 million users globally, and therefore many times a variety of transnational content was uploaded by the users. TikTok is a mobile app where users make and share their short videos. You must be 13 or older to become a TikTok user. You only have to put in your email address and date of birth for identification, and therefore it was easy for underage children to create an account. Mian and Elaine, who were both in 4th grade and under the age of 13, also had an account. There are many issues raised regarding accounts of underage children. In 2021, TikTok has announced to remove about 7 million accounts that were suspected to belong to underage children in the first quarter. The focus of this presentation today is not on discussing the age appropriateness of TikTok and its content. Rather, I want to take this time to discuss that many children are using TikTok for entertainment, and in the process, they are also critically thinking through race and racial stereotypes. You can notice the research questions on the slide, but in this presentation, I specifically go over the question of what issues did children perceive in their appropriation of the transnational pop culture. Before we go into the details of this study, I want to quickly go over literature. The definition of pop culture has evolved in many ways, and through social culture theorists, the definition, in quote, shifted from cultural objects as primary source of meaning to individuals' experience of everyday culture. And most recently, this everyday culture has been saturated by people's engagement with social media. Hence, the content has expanded to transnational materials that users can engage in from all over the world. As this study took place in a 4th grade classroom, I briefly go over the literature of childhood, as it was viewed as a commercial and cultural category. And through social culture theorists, children are no longer seen as naive and innocent ones who don't know what's happening in their world, but children who are seen as proactive agents who also participate in the meaning-making process of pop culture. To review literature on Asian Americans, as seen in the quote, the term Asian American is a very complex term, as there are nearly 20 million people who trace their roots to more than 20 countries. And racist social construct is also revealed through the history of Asian Americans in the States. Many scholars have shown how Asian Americans have been discriminated in the US, and only when in the interest of the whites intersected with Asian Americans, they were recognized. One important thing to highlight in relation to this research is that Asians are constantly battling this notion of being perpetual foreigners and experience microaggressions in their daily lives. This will be reviewed through the findings as well. There were 2 main theoretical frameworks I had in this study. As I looked at the daily lives of my participants, I looked through a social cultural theory that really viewed children as proactive agents who were very capable. And this also meant that the appropriations that they had of transnational pop culture could be seen as funds of knowledge in the classrooms. However, it was also evident that though they are very capable, their worlds are also embedded with colorblind perspectives. Hence, looking through critical race theory enabled me to understand the permanence of racism in schools and society. This was an ethnographic case study done in a 4th grade classroom at Central Elementary School located in the Midwest. I want to highlight that the student enrollment for the school that year was the total of 297 students, 26 white, 184 Black, 12 Hispanic, 56 Asians, 1 Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, 1 American Indian, and 17 2 or more races. Data was collected for a total of 6 months. I wanted to make sure that I observed students in various settings within their school day. So official settings were classroom times and music classes. Unofficial settings were recess and free choice time. And for data analysis, I personally listened to and transcribed all the audio recorded observations, then went into open coding analysis of the transcripts and the field notes and lesson plans, which eventually led to focus coding. One conversation I had with the 2 girls, I had a chance to ask what it was like to be Asian Americans in their school. They shared a few stories of how they liked being part of the parade that they had once a year, where it was a chance to teach other students about their ethnic backgrounds. but also struggles they encountered as well. They were frustrated that they were always assumed to be Chinese and how they had to repeatedly teach their friends. This conversation then sparked Elaine's memory of an incident she read on TikTok. She started telling me about the Blackface incident. To provide a little context, in February 2019, a Chinese makeup artist uploaded a makeup transformation video on TikTok. This video went viral immediately and also created a debate by its users from all over the world, and rightly so. This particular comment is not from the TikTok video, but a Facebook video of a similar content. This is just one of the response, and most of the response cannot be found anymore as this video was taken down by its original creator. TikTok was being used for entertainment, but it was also a place where users were critically thinking through how content revealed permanence of racism on social media. As you can see in the quote, digital blackface introduces age-old stereotypes to a new generation of digital natives. Now remember back to the original conversation I was having with Abby and Elaine. I had asked them about their local experiences at school as Asian Americans, which automatically led Elaine to remember this TikTok incident. As she continued to talk about the video, she shared the comments that she saw on TikTok. She said, in quote, one of the people said the N-word, and the Asian girl, she said the N-word, and everyone got on her and said, you're not supposed to say that. And then another person was sticking up for the Asian and said, you do know if it was flipped around, and Mia interrupted, saying, if there was actually a Black person, and if they were trying to act Chinese, nobody would get on them. And Elaine said, everybody in the comment would say, oh, this is so funny, this is so funny. But really, the reality flipped over. It's the Asian people getting hated on. And so as I was listening to them share about this incident and what they saw on TikTok, I couldn't link to what it meant to them until they told me about their personal stories. Mia shared that once she posted on TikTok, yay, going home, to which a friend who is Black replied, where to, Japan, China? And Mia's reply was, I'm not even from there. And the friend replied, well, it looks like you're from there. This all happened on the comment section of the TikTok. And Mia shared her frustrations of automatically being assumed that she was from China or Japan when she was Vietnamese. Elaine also went on to share stories of being called Ching Ching Chong by her friend at school. When she stood up for herself and asked her friend, how would you feel if I said the N-word to you? Her friend replied, I'll punch you. And this friend was also African-American Black. As they were reading the many comments on Blackface and TikTok, it reminded them of their local racialized encounters at school and on TikTok. Here, I want to emphasize that children are not just naive and use TikTok only for entertainment, but as proactive users, they revealed that they were keenly aware of the transnational debates regarding race and stereotypes that they saw on social media, and also their own experiences related to that in their personal lives. Later, Mia and Elaine also shared that they understood how hurtful the N-word is to the Black community, and especially their peers, and they were aware that these terms were embedded with racist stereotypes. However, it was also very true that they were also receiving stereotypical comments on TikTok and at school. But at school, in the curriculum, there was no time to talk about these critical issues that students were facing. This study does not attempt to make any haste generalizations, as it is a focus on one key case. However, I hope to add on to the implications of research and practice. Children with multicultural identity do not leave their complex identities at home. Rather, they bring in their funds of knowledge to navigate through different relationships and to express their complex identity. Therefore, teachers, administrators, and policymakers must provide a classroom where they will be valued and evaluated in a more relevant way. Schools must become a place where they can critically think through the different issues that they face. As we continue to see children as proactive agents, we must also acknowledge the transnational pop culture as funds of knowledge and the implications it has for research. In order to do so, we must have a permeable curriculum that allows all students to be evaluated in a way that honors their funds of knowledge. Continuing the discussion of race as a social construction through CRT, we notice that schooling continues to show how it is colorblinded. Also, permanence of racism shows, we notice that Asians are perhaps maybe permanently perpetual foreigners in this society. And often their voice mainly gets heard where the interests of the whites meet. Therefore, it is important to continue to counter the main narratives through their counter storytelling. And in terms of practice, we can help teachers better understand what critical race theory is and what culturally relevant pedagogy is. A lot of the times, teachers have professional developments and they're thrown with all these terms, but they don't know how to really implement them into their classroom and how to see the students' world through these lenses. So we need better professional developments. We also need to continue to work towards permeable curriculum, where students can discuss the different issues that they see on social media and just in their everyday lives. As we think about culturally relevant teaching, evaluation, and assessment, I believe it's important to remember that when a child comes from a certain background, it does not mean the same for all. As Henry Louis Gates said, there's 42 million Blacks and 42 million ways to be Black. And applying this wisdom, we also see that Asian population is also very complex. And therefore, it is pivotal to ensure a space at school where all children's voices can be heard. Thank you for listening.
Karen, you're muted.
Thank you. I was saying thanks to everybody, and I wanted to return to the gallery view. I want to open it up for questions. Rather than commenting on each paper, I'll just share a couple of observations about themes and linkages, and then perhaps that will give you enough time to check your notes about what connections you saw. I thought this was just a fascinating series of examples, and certainly the first and second paper, well, all three addressed issues of context in important ways, I think. And while the learning climate was the context of the first one, I think we could also zoom out to, I was curious about the Christian base of the YMCA itself, and that tied to KT's self-introduction as a person of faith that grounded her work. So I saw that as an interesting, broader context piece. And then the whole thing of belonging, bridging from the second paper and emotions to the third paper of how people felt a sense of belonging or a disengagement from belonging in both these virtual settings, such as TikTok, and the real school settings. So the whole issue of engagement and belonging I saw as a theme. And then across all three, although the first authors were bookmarking that, the student outcome piece, as their next step rather than specifically their focus today, but there was so much attention on young people, on children as proactive agents. I found that just fascinating in the construction of their own identity as sources of information to give adults feedback on how their constructions of space, be it a classroom space or a museum activity, are received, how they're experienced by the young people themselves. I think to me that last point was the strongest thread. But I'd like to open it up so that you can talk directly to the presenters and raise questions or share observations. And I encourage the presenters, of course, to share with one another as well. We have a generous half hour, so there's good opportunity for conversation. So just unmute when you're ready to share.
Katie, I have a question for you. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned that you have 4 mini studies, and I'm just curious, and you might have mentioned it, maybe I missed it, where you are at in the process of those mini studies, and then once those mini studies are done or once the funding has ended, sort of what is the next phase of this work?
Yeah, totally. So we just finished our first mini study this summer. So that's sort of what you heard the little snippets from. And the idea of having the 4 mini studies is to really be able to refine our questions and our overall approach to data collection. So the ultimate goal is really in this project, not so much the findings as being able to have a set of, a research protocol that we feel really good about. And the idea is that we would then apply for further funding to actually do a larger scale study. So yeah, it's at this stage, it's fairly qualitative, small sample sizes. We said 15 people per, we ended up having 17 this time, but small groups of young people, and really just taking the time to learn with those young people. Our youth advisor work has been really profound, actually, being able to co-create. I mean, I would never have come up with the Instagram inspired way of describing yourself, for instance, but that's something that one of the young people brought up, and that has been really successful. And I think was a really cool connection to Yunjin, your presentation and the social media. So I really appreciated that. I'm curious for you, how did you come to the social media? And like the quotations you shared were amazing, that like the depth of the processing for the young people. And I'm just curious, how did you come upon that?
Actually, it was through the participants. I was actually more interested, being Korean background myself. I knew that I don't know if everyone knows, but BTS, the Korean K-pop group, was gaining more interest in the States and among the children. So I wanted to see if students were talking more about those like types of different transnational pop culture. But when I actually went into the classroom to observe, TikTok was the main thing. And so it was actually through the participants and actually all the other classmates that I started thinking more about TikTok and social media and their engagement with it. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, it's really reversing how evaluators normally enter a subject by, and it reminds me actually of the Indigenous plenary session that emphasized listening as the very first activity, and sort of flipping the normal, I don't know, enter with goals and objectives type of approaches to evaluation. Those are amazing entry points that you got to it through the young people themselves. I just found that so wise, but also it slowed me down to get me to see things and feel things in a different way. And I think that's huge.
Well, thank you. It's been huge personally to me. I know in doing this work is like being able to do that reflection and really listen to my body in ways that I was previously just not connected to. But I think I've come to look at it really as something that we can offer that like participating in research and in evaluation can be a way of developing that emotional intelligence, and that emotional intelligence is a valuable skill, especially when we talk about the context of anti-racism and sort of confronting oppression. We know that that is really emotionally draining work, and to have those emotional skills, to be able to have the persistence to go through it is a valuable thing for people. So if our data collection can be building that up for folks, that can be a value add.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is the process, how the process of data collection is experienced as a potentially positive gift rather than something that's extractive, as I'm sort of used to thinking of it in one sense or another, that we administer a survey or we do an interview and we walk away, but we don't think as much about making the process meaningful to the respondent. And I think I agree with you that that's part of the deconstruction of systems of oppression also. Other responses, ideas, reactions. Hi.
Hi, I don't know if I can. I hope you're not like looking at my nostrils. I'm on the phone and I'm sitting outside just for a change. I wanted to just share some comments. Thank you everybody for sharing your work and your papers and all of that. I guess I'll start with the last one. The youth, the Asian youth that was talking about how this is just a comment. First of all, the youth that said about, being addressed as like Ching Chang Chong, kind of that. It was a little bit, I don't know, shocking, maybe like shocking deja vu that so many decades later. I grew up in Austria, for example. I have just like, I can't pronounce your name correctly, where you said you were growing up in Singapore. I grew up in Thailand and Austria, and I feel like a lot of that happened back then, and it's shocking to me that it still happens now, as if nothing had changed between that. So many Asians are still, assumed to be Chinese or Japanese, and you would think with all the, social media and internet and that kind of connection, that wouldn't be happening as much anymore. But alas, the other thing I wanted to ask really is, for the first presenters, I work for SNAP Ed in Washington State, and we are doing strategic planning and a move to be more culturally responsive in our evaluation. And I was wondering if the PowerPoint that you had, is this something that you would be willing to share so we can study it a little bit more here in Washington State? It was just wonderful, and it had me thinking about, I don't know, it was inspiring. And I would love to be able to share it with our team here. Even though we have our own strategic planning going on, of course, I think it would be great to just see examples of how other people are doing it.
Yeah, on behalf of the Y, we're happy to share. I can't speak for Beth, my co-collaborator, but it seems like yes on her end as well.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'll put our emails in the chat for everyone. So everyone, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Yeah, we'd be more than happy and excited to hear what everyone else is doing and to talk more about, about what we've learned so far.
Also, this session is being recorded. So I feel sometimes information overload at these conferences, but they will be not immediately, but within the next few weeks be posted on the CREA website, where we can go back and review them and think more deeply about them.
Yeah, and I could, since we're chatting about the first presentation, I see a question in the chat from Pamela.
Oh, thank you.
That I can I can respond to. So the question is, what may be behind our findings about improved practice despite low dosage? So,
oh yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting to us as well. So the finding was that teachers who attended PLCs in kind of a lower dosed way still showed improved practices over the years. We've talked about this extensively. We're not entirely sure what's going on. We didn't necessarily measure the uptake of our PLC or our PD content. So we don't know, we have an idea and we have some anecdotal data, but we can't say strongly about certain things, but we're not sure if teachers love the content and are taking it in and spreading it at their sites, or if they're coming to PLCs because they feel like they have to. So there's that kind of limitation with the uptake piece. The other piece is that we do have a PD system. So we were measuring our professional learning communities, which is a subset of our overarching system. But within that system, teachers also have access to a variety of staff that are experts in a ton of different stuff. I kind of consider it like a wraparound service to our PLCs. And so I think that that might be driving some of it as well. So even though they're not attending our professional learning communities in heavy saturation, they're still getting the trickle effect of the content. And that's a really cool thing for us to look at in the future. The second question in that chat was, what are other opportunities for learning about equity and justice and Head Start teachers that may be beyond PD? And that's a really good question. And I wish I had one of my Head Start teachers with me, because they would definitely probably be able to speak a lot more eloquently about this. But some things that I was thinking about when I saw that question. So what we did at the YMCA was we did a complete kind of revamp of our classroom spaces to make our classroom spaces, the things within our classrooms, representative of the children in our classrooms. And that was everything from the toys that we had, the dolls, the physical environment, but also the books that were on shelves, the things that they interacted with. And I believe that that is a really important piece. Another thing that we talk really heavily about is how do we create an anti-racist organization that is really wrapping around the concept of promoting and advancing equity and understanding the systemic drivers for why we are where we are today, right? And that doesn't happen overnight, and we are not, we're doing it, but we're definitely not there. So that's another really important piece. And then I think the last thing would be to just make space for what I would term as kind of more liberal leaning things. So for example, we let our kids stage a protest. We had 3 and 4-year-olds at our YMCA stage a protest because they wanted a field trip. And this was all motivated by a book that they had read about Martin Luther King Jr. So we allow for these things that in some families or some spaces or even some learning environments might be deemed as radical or more liberal, but we think it's really important. And so doing things like that, I think, are kind of somewhat informal ways to continue to drive that equity piece.
I might just chime in there with the plug for YMCA's Learning and Evaluation team. I don't know if it came out in the presentation as much, but this really, like, this evaluation is a flash in time or a point in time of the learning and evaluation team's work across the organization to build in reflective practice. And that ties in closely with programming and how that reflective practice is organically or sometimes formally built into that, but then also bringing data closer to the staff so that they are engaged and involved with creating that data, creating that story, and also interpreting it. And so I don't know, Jen, if you want to add about that, but I think in terms of learning, to that second question about opportunities for learning about equity and justice for Head Start teachers, I think there's potentially some ties, to continue on both of those strains for that.
Yeah, I'll just add, we believe that especially in Black and Brown spaces, they need to have access to data. It is a piece of equity to not only be a part of an evaluation, but to also be on the receiving end of the data of that evaluation. So we are very transparent, especially within our Head Start community, when we are doing anything evaluative, anything with data. And it's a very participant-led and collaborative process.
That's the protest. I love that example. And talk about student agency. I mean, that's just remarkable. The other thing I just wanted to note in response to your comment, Jen, is the emphasis on space. I first missed that as a theme that permeates all three of these, either physical space or virtual space. And it occurs to me that evaluators often overlook attention to the space in which their evaluand is located or sitting. And this session has been a really powerful example of the importance of interrogating spaces. Other thoughts, connections, and certainly questions for our presenters?
Jen and Elizabeth, in your presentation, you sort of teased what's coming next and thinking about sort of student outcomes, but also working to be more culturally responsive in evaluation as well as the programming. Would you be willing to share, like, what are your plans for that, or like, what are your questions, and where do you see that going?
Sure, I can take that, and then Beth, if you want to add. So to get to student outcomes, we know it takes time, right? And I think everyone on this call could figure out, even if you don't do anything with students, that long cascade it takes to get there, which if anyone is a funder on this call, it takes a long time. So if you want impact, you got to give us some time to get there. But we are going to figure out, we haven't dove deep into it yet just because of COVID and a variety of other things happening at the YMCA, but we are working on a research plan to link this content piece, like I said, to the student outcome piece that we have. We also are attempting to figure out, once our students leave the YMCA and go on to our public school system or wherever they go after the YMCA, can we continue to kind of follow them? And this is a complicated thing for us to do. So we're working kind of through that process and that piece. Continuing with the anti-bias work, we are, continuing to have conversations. We have a very, very firm foundation of what it is that we're teaching within our classroom practice and within our PD system. From an evaluation perspective, if we do this again or in a similar process, it will be a lot more immersive with staff from the Y. When we initially did this work, there was a small group of people at the YMCA and at on Beth's team that really drove this fidelity tool creation and use. And one of the things that we reflect on often is how we could have been better about including teachers, site directors, even parents, to just really make sure that we were hitting it hard with all of those different pieces. So that's going to be a main focus in the next iteration of this work.
I'll just add, that, and I mean, we were planning to do data collection right as the pandemic was hitting, and so the pandemic, I mean, it really did impact the community, the context of the community. It also impacted the evaluation. So even some of those lower hanging fruit, like getting teacher perspectives through focus groups and surveys, that was an intentional decision. And YMCA had a process that critically looked at, is it appropriate to be collecting data at this point, as in some ways some of the programs were pivoting to focus on emergency needs. It was also a very uncertain time at that point. Even I think today I sometimes forget, but it was just, there were so many unknowns. So we didn't capture that. But again, looking at this as part of that broader system, one of the things is how to better capture the teachers' experiences of PLC, of their work in YMCA in the classroom, and how does that impact this work. And Katie, you were talking earlier about emotions and experience of race and racism and that connection. And I think that would certainly be relevant here as well, which is something that we didn't delve into, but I think is relevant in the classrooms and the context that this work is taking place.
a lot of opportunity for rich exchange. I want to go back to Esther and just raise for all of you, but starting with her, the issue of how or to what extent your own personal identity, for example, ethnic identity or gender identity, affected your relationship with Mia and Elaine and your ability to use their wisdom as collaborators. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it was actually very interesting because even as I entered the classroom for the first time, the very first time to do the observations, the students immediately, like the other non-Asian students, immediately asked, like, is that your mom? Like, to the Asian students. So there was that automatic link of like, or, they would other students would come up to me and ask, like, do you know Jackie Chan? Like, I like Jackie Chan, or where are you really from? And they'll like raise their eyebrow. And so definitely, I definitely understood where my participants were coming from and their frustrations that they were experiencing in local, like in their classroom settings and virtual settings. And but I think I tried my best just as a researcher to listen to their story and not impose my own stories onto them. So yeah, even as I even had to ask them, like, who, like, what ethnic or what racial, like, how would you racially self-identify yourself? And Asians were what they chose. So I just went with that.
For Mia and Elaine chose Asian as how they would identify themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you just said? Okay. All right. Excellent. So if you had been older or white, do you think you would have gotten the same level of trust or response, or that it would have gone in a completely different direction?
I think children are very accepting. And my own advisor, Dr. Ann Dyson, she does research with a lot of students from different ethnic backgrounds, and especially she's white, but she, does a lot of research with African-American students, and they're very, like, they become best buddies. And so, I think there could be limits of like really understanding what they're saying, but I think children are always just, if they know that you're genuinely there to listen to them, they are going to open up, I think.
Thank you. Other thoughts? We're closing in on the end, but we still have about 10 more minutes should we choose to use them. I can't wait to go back and watch these videos, because it did feel like that. Someone in a prior session said, use the metaphor of fire hose of information, like when it comes at you and you can't quite capture it all. And I just felt like these were 3 wonderfully provocative presentations that both raised issues and suggested some powerful approaches to addressing racism and coloniality in the programs we're evaluating and in our evaluations themselves. So I very much want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences today. And I welcome any closing thoughts or comments. I'm not trying to shut it down prematurely.
Well, I don't want to keep it going prematurely if people want to leave. But Karen, I love that last question. And I wonder, just as a follow-up for Esther or for anyone, of how do you sort of go about raising your own identity when you're working with participants? I think, like, in our traditional approach, where, like, traditional training would generally say, like, you keep yourself out of it and try to be this, like, objective, external person. But like, how do you, other than what's visible, like, do you, and in what circumstances do you share? I know I remember when I was doing data collection for the project that I talked about, there was one young person who was filling out sort of a demographic questionnaire, and it was an open-ended gender question. And the person looked at me and said, like, I don't know, it changes. And, you know, without having thought about my theoretical perspective to this, I just said, yeah, mine too. And like suddenly that person opened up. And like the conversation after that moment was just so much richer just from that little piece. And then we can think about, like, Karen, your question of like, how does that change the data collection? How can we try to be like consistent, or should we throw the idea of consistency out the window when we think about those things? And where does the relationship building play into the sort of evaluator as instrument approach? So I don't know, I would love to hear from anyone of how do you approach that and how do you think about those things?
I love your reflection that one little remark caused a connection, led to a connection. And to me, from my academic perspective, I see that as a validity issue. It supports the authenticity of the information that's shared following, because that connection led to recognition, to the person, the respondent, feeling like they were being seen and that it was safe to share information in a genuine way. And I think, to back it up, I think it's hard to do that kind of work in systems, larger systems that may not be entirely safe for or merit that kind of trust, you know, so that one can also, on the downside, possibly create a vulnerability if the person has opened up and then the system is squelching it, or the expectation is set that change will follow and the agency will lead in this direction, but it doesn't happen. Like, did they get their field trip, Jen? Yeah, so that's a good thing.
They got two field trips.
That's great. You know, but your why sounds so much different than my why, which is very rule driven and you know, I could easily picture them saying, no, the budget doesn't allow for field trips, or this, that, or the other reason, but squelching the expression of agency that the evaluation brought forth, and then what's the reaction to, you know, to be dealt with.
Yeah, Katie, your story, I was thinking about your question and then I got sidetracked, because what I really thought was good for you for making it such a safe space where a youth felt comfortable saying that. And I think that that's one of the biggest things as evaluators that we can do, is really bring in trauma-informed approaches and practices into our work, which is sometimes really, really, really hard.
Yeah,
harder than it sounds, right? And so I don't know, that just struck me. And again, like, kudos for you, because that youth felt really safe.
yeah. I think that's a good note to close on. I do think that this work involves trauma. I mean, we're dealing with, we're asking about trauma. And so I think that's great wisdom to remember to go back to trauma-informed practice and those ideas to make sure that our evaluation processes themselves are not triggering. We talk about them being respectful. We don't always stop and think about them being triggering and reinstituting trauma. So that's another good, wise advice to close on. And thank you all so much for being here today and participating. And I hope that you can use CREA as a vehicle for staying in touch with one another and continuing conversations on these important matters. Thank you so much.